this is the next part of 6.2 where we're going to look at the slope of a line from a graph. Our goal here is to be able to graph a line. So the first thing we need to know is what the slope looks like on a graph. And the slope is the same as our rate of change that we looked at yesterday. So first thing I want you to pay attention to is if a line is increasing from left to right, it has a positive slope. So its slope would be a positive number. However, if a line is decreasing from left to right, it has a negative slope. And so, important to know your left and your right here. The left side of the graph is over here. The right side is over here. And so if we start here on the left side and go towards the right side, we can see that our arrow is increasing here. So if this graph is increasing from left to right, we know the slope here would be positive. For the next one here, as we travel along this line from the left side of the graph to the right side, we can see that our arrow is decreasing here. So this graph would have a negative slope. And then for this last one, as we travel from left to right on this graph, you can see our arrow increasing, so that graph has a positive slope. This is really important because one of the biggest things that I find students have trouble with is making sure they have the sign on their slope correct. So let's look at how we find slope. So slope is a rate of change, like we've already talked about here. And so to find a rate of change, we are looking at the change in y over the change in x. So we already did this a little bit yesterday from our graphs. These should be a little bit easier than the graphs that we were looking at yesterday. We use that delta y over delta x to mean change in y over change in x. And a shortcut we sometimes call this is rise over run. Now that's of course not an official mathematical term there, but rise, when you rise up, you go up or down. When you run across the room. So the first thing you want to do when you're finding the slope of a line is you want to find you two good points to use. These points could be anywhere on the graph, but it is best to choose a point where your line crosses perfectly at the grid lines so you can count easily. So for example, these would be two good points to use for this graph. And so you're looking at your change in y over your change in x. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you, we can think about positive and negative directions if we want. I'm going to tell you to completely ignore signs on this until you get to the end. Now, other videos that you might watch are going to do this a little bit differently, but this is what I'm going to tell you. Ignore signs. Don't worry about whether it's up, down, left, or right, and then worry about the slope, the sign of the slope at the end of the problem. Or at the beginning, it really doesn't matter, but we're not going to worry about whether we're going up, down, left, or right. So if I start at either one of these points, what I've got to think of is my vertical change over my horizontal change. So I'm going to start at this point right here, and first I want to think, if I start right here, how much do I have to go up or down vertically? And the answer right here is that I would have to go down 1 if I'm trying to get over here to this other point. And then I would have to go to the right 5 in this case. So up or down, that's my change in y. And left or right, that's my change in x. So my slope for this graph, change in y over change in x, is going to be, my change in y was 1, my change in x was 5. Now, the slope of this line is not 1/5 because I told you at the beginning, if a line is decreasing from the left to the right, then you need to have a negative slope. So the answer for this right here, my slope, is going to be negative 1/5. Now technically you can put that negative in the numerator or the denominator. Don't put it in both places. It's most common to see it written out in front of the fraction here. So wait till you get to the end, or you could have decided at the very beginning this graph has to have a negative slope. Don't worry about the signs in your changes, change of y and change of x. Alright, here's another example. We need to find the slope of this line. Now, I will tell you, it is easier to find the slope if you pick points that are close together. So, for example, if I pick this point right here and this point right here, it's going to make it a little bit easier to find the slope of the line. So, if I'm thinking about change in y, that's my vertical change. I'm going to start at this point right here. Vertical change, I'm going up 2. And then, so that's my change in y. And then I want to think about my change in x. So my change in x here, in this case, is going to be 3 because I would have to travel to the right 3. So my slope is going to equal change in y over change in x, which is 2 over 3 for this graph. And if we stop now, always think about your sign, either at the beginning or the end one. And this graph, as you go from left to right, it is increasing. So if the graph is increasing, then you have a positive slope. So 2/3, positive 2/3 is your answer for this slope. Alright, I don't know why this is down so low. Let's see if I can fix that. Alright, so let's find the slope of this line here. Now, this actually is the same line as before, but I just want to show you that you can still find the slope even if you pick points that are much further away from each other. So let's pick this point right here and this point right here. Okay? It makes it a little more difficult to do, but you can still do the problem this way. So maybe you don't see that there's this point right here or this point right here that you could have used instead, or this point right here. So it's still change in y over change in x. So in this graph, I would have to go up this far and to the right this far in order to get from this bottom point up to this top point. And so that is a change in y of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And it is a change in x of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, so my change in y over change in x is 8 over 12. But 8 over 12 will reduce. I can divide both of those numbers by 4. So 8 divided by 4 would be 2, and 12 divided by 4 would be 3, and I get 2/3 as my answer. This answer is positive because this graph is increasing. Notice, that's the same thing I got on this last problem. These are the same lines. 3 and 4 are the same line. I just wanted to show you that you can pick points anywhere. Now, it's easier if you pick the points that are close together because you don't have to count as far. Alright, so here we have a horizontal line. And so a horizontal line, I could pick any 2 points on the graph. I'm just going to pick one here. If I want to get from this point right here on the left to this point over here on the right, then I would have to go change in y over change in x. Change in y over change in x. Well, my change in y is going to be 0 because I'm not going to go up or down any. And then my change in x, in this particular case, with the points I've picked, my change in x would be 3, but I could have picked another point. It really wouldn't matter, because 0 divided by any number is going to be 0. Okay? So horizontal lines have a slope of 0. every time. So if you see a horizontal line, you know that line has a slope of 0. Remember that slope tells us the steepness of the line. So a horizontal line, a flat line right there, if you think of the ground being a flat line, it has 0 steepness. It's not steep at all. So horizontal lines have a slope of 0. Make sure this is something that you remember. Let's look at what happens with a vertical line. So with a vertical line, I'm going to just pick a couple points right here. So change in y over change in x is what we've got to do. So if I'm going to start at this bottom point and go up to the top point, I have to go up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 for these points I've chosen. So my change in y is 5. So I'll put that right here on the top of my fraction. And then my change in x is going to be, my change in x is 0 because I'm not going to move to the left or the right any. Now, this gives us a problem right here because if you try to divide 5 by 0, you can't do it. You can type it into your calculator, you're going to get an error. This is what we call undefined. And you should have talked about this before, I think. If you haven't, let me know and we'll talk about it in class a little bit. So this is undefined here. So the slope of a vertical line is always undefined. And I always tell my students that's because it's so steep you can't possibly describe it. If you have a line that's slanted, you can tell me how slanted that line is. But the steepest possible line you could have is a vertical line, and that line is so steep you cannot even define how steep it is. Let's do a couple more where we've got to find the slope. So I've got this graph right here. I'm going to pick me 2 points. I'm going to pick this point right here and this point right here. And we are going to go change in y over change in x. So I'm going to pick this bottom point this time. So change in y, that's vertical, up or down. So I would have to go up 1, 2, 3, 4. So my change in y is 4. And then I'd have to go to the left 2. So my change in x is 2. So change in y over change in x is going to be 4 over 2. And 4 divided by 2 is going to give us 2 here. Now, I could have used this point right here, actually. That would have been even better. I'll go up 2 and to the left 1. Rise 2, run 1 here. And so, remember, always for these, you need to think about whether the graph is increasing or decreasing. This graph is decreasing from left to right. So that means that slope is actually negative. So negative 2 is your answer for this line. Okay, here's our last one that we're going to do together. And we have another line here. And I'm going to pick a point right here and right here. Okay. You may want to think about whether the slope's positive or negative from the very beginning. Right here, I can see this line's decreasing, so my answer needs to be negative. And so I'm going to think change in y. That's your rise. If you're thinking rise over run, change in y, it's vertical over change in x, horizontal. So if I start at this point right here, I would have to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So my change in y would be 5. And then I have to go left or right. Let's not do that. I have to go to the right here, 1, 2, 3. So my change in x would be 3. And so my change in y over change in x would be 5 over 3. And this line is decreasing, so that needs to be negative. So my slope here is negative 5 over 3. Okay. Use this information to help you on your IXL assignment today. If you have any questions, let me know.